back to another video. Today I want to talk to you about how to properly measure your progress when it comes to flexibility training. Sometimes progress is pretty obvious, other times it feels like we plateaued. Actually, is that the case? You know, if we're doing normal training outside of bodyweight training or calisthenics or flexibility training, progress is usually quite obvious and quite quantitative. If we're trying to lose weight, we can look at the scales and we can measure body fat. If we're trying to get stronger in the gym, we can just see how much we're lifting. Are we lifting 100 kilos last week? Are we lifting more this week? It's very simple to put a number on it and assess, are things going in the right direction? When it comes to flexibility training, it's much more qualitative. It's about how does a position feel? Does it look better? Does it feel better? Obviously, I would like to add some quantitative assessment to this just to make sure we're making progress. And also, when it feels like we aren't making progress, is that actually the case, or is that more down to our interpretation and our feeling of it? So in today's video, I kind of want to share with you my 3-step process that I would use to analyze, are we making progress with my own training and also with clients as well? Now, definitely the points I'm going to make are probably obvious, but it's the combination of the 3 that should help you make a really good assessment as to whether your flexibility training is moving things in the right direction. Now, before we get to these 3 kind of steps that I like to use, I want to mention why one of them isn't how a position feels. Now, feeling is a very subjective thing, not necessarily a bad thing, but it's bad if we don't use it in the right way. So an instance where how a stretch feels is good would be in a very short-term instance. Say we're doing a flexibility session, we were testing our pike flexibility beforehand, we then do some drills, we test it at the end. That is a good instance in which feeling is a good metric to use because we're making changes in the moment, and then from those changes we can assess what's actually maybe limiting our pike if certain stretches make things feel better. Where it's not useful is over a long-term period, because that stretch feeling, that discomfort feeling, that's related to our stretch reflex. Now, the stretch reflex is when our body puts the brakes on. That stretch feeling occurs when we're getting towards the end of our range of motion. Now, that stretch feeling will be the same whether you have limited range of motion or whether you have very good range of motion. You're gonna feel it in different positions, but the feeling is gonna be the same, which is why I don't tend to like how a stretch feels, because as I said, it's probably always going to feel tight when you're towards the maximum level of range of motion. Since we're talking about progress, I want to quickly mention, before we get into all the measurement side of things, is that progress isn't always linear. And this is especially the case with flexibility. It tends to be this staggered ladder or step that builds slowly towards that position. It also varies massively depending on the time of the day and just the day itself. You're gonna be much tighter in the mornings, more restricted. You're gonna be a little bit more flexible in the evenings. If you're sick, you're gonna be tighter. If you're fatigued from training, you're gonna be tighter. If you're stressed out, you're gonna be tighter. There's gonna be lots of things that are gonna influence flexibility on a small scale, but when we take that to the macro level, the thing that matters is consistency of practice. But there is going to be that fluctuation in those short-term periods, which, to be honest with you, is why I think measuring progress accurately is so important, because if we base it on feeling, which many of us will do, oftentimes that feeling is going to change day to day, week to week. But if we have something quantitative that we can just say, actually, this is how it is, and we can show that it's improved over the last 6 months quite substantially because of these numbers, that's going to make ourselves feel better when it comes to training, and then stay more motivated, to then stay more consistent, to then make more progress, and it becomes self-fulfilling. So what can we do to properly assess the flexibility gains that we've been making? Right, let me talk you through this 3-stage process. So point number 1 is document. Now, very simply, this means take photos or videos of your training. Hopefully this one is obvious, and I'm sure many of you are already doing this, but there is a little bit of a nuance in terms of how you might do this. And it's not just about taking photos that look good for Instagram. In fact, this is furthest from the truth, because oftentimes if you're taking a photo for Instagram, you're trying to manipulate variables to make that image look the best way that it can possible, or certainly that's what a lot of people do on Instagram. Instead, here we want to provide ourselves with an honest representation of our training at the time. So we don't want to be manipulating angles and changing angles to make it look like we've made loads of progress, when in reality, maybe we haven't. So there's a couple of rules that I would follow when it comes to documenting your training. If we're filming an exercise or a progression or a position, try to film it in the same angle. Very simply, if we move up or down or side to side, then that's going to change how the exercise or the position looks. And again, it may make it look like we've made no progress or better progress than we actually have. try to keep the angle consistent. Number two is try to keep the amount of warm-up you have consistent as well. A very simple example of this is if I was to go into my side split cold versus if I was on my fourth or fifth set of side splits, the difference is going to be quite substantial probably. And it might look like I've made 6 months progress in the space of about 30 minutes. So whenever we're going to take photos to assess progress, my general recommendation is to have maximum 1, maybe 2 warm-up sets before taking an assessment photo. This gives us a little bit of time to warm up into the position, so we're not just completely cold, but also we're not going to be able to abuse completely some of the stretching methods that are going to increase our range of motion, so we get a disproportional representation of what our actual flexibility is. So pretty simple. Take photos, take videos, pretty easy to do, and as I said, a lot of people are probably already doing this. However, this is still kind of a qualitative measure. We're looking at 2 images and we're saying, does that one look better than that one? And in some instances, this will be extremely obvious when we're making beginner progress or good gains. But when we get to more advanced positions, like maybe the splits or the bridge, there's more nuance that's happening in those positions. And sometimes we can look at 2 pictures and maybe they look very similar, but actually there's a significant change in what we're trying to work on. And unless you have some further measurements, you're not going to be able to properly assess that progress. So point number 2 is use measurements or targets to assess your gains in flexibility. Now this can be used and applied to the photos themselves and the documentation themselves. Very simply getting something like a protractor app on your phone and measuring the difference between points or the angles between joints is going to be an easy way to assess, are you making progress or not? If you're a bit lax with how you place the points that you're measuring the angles from, you can dramatically alter the progress. So if we need to try and keep our reference points anatomically somewhat consistent with, the same angle or the same warm up. So it should give you a pretty accurate representation of how the joint angle is changing over a period of time. Now, if you're somebody who is less fond of the digital aspect of this, and I personally, I like the protractor side of things, but it's a little bit too fiddly for me. I prefer to use something practical in the session. And that's basically, we can use, either actual measurements and units, so things like centimeters or inches if you're American, or we can use targets to assess how our flexibility is changing. Again, probably examples here is going to be the easiest way to explain this. So targets, first of all, nice and simply, let's use the pike as an example. Can you touch your toes? Can you get fingers to the ground? Can you get knuckles to ground? Can you get palms to ground? And then really once we get palms to ground, can you elevate your feet and still get palms to ground? A nice simple metric to assess our pike flexibility. Another example, say with front splits, can we touch our hamstring or our hip down to a yoga block on its side, flat? Can we get it down to the floor? Just using these target parameters, something to focus on trying to touch as a way of measuring our flexibility, is a really simple way of just assessing our training progress. And again, this one doesn't need to be like we're testing a position. We can just do this as part of our training. Using target-based approaches is actually a fantastic way to increase the effectiveness of our flexibility training, a method taught to me by Emmett Lewis and a foundation of his modern methods of mobility practice. It's something that I pretty much include in every set of my training of flexibility, and it's something I try and get my clients to do as well. Again, you can kind of consider this as the equivalent of measuring how much load you're putting on the barbell, but for flexibility training. Finally, another example would be, including an actual unit of measurement, like centimeters, for example. Very simply, maybe if we're doing our side split, we place yoga blocks either side of our feet, we slide down into our side split, we go as far as we can, we then exit the stretch, leaving the yoga blocks at the outside of the feet, and we can measure the gap between the 2 yoga blocks, and from there we can assess each week, is that gap increasing? It's another good way of seeing if our progress is improving. Should be mentioned that with side split, this will be important up to a certain extent. As you get down towards the bottom, this figure doesn't change that much either. So whether it's digital or physical, try and put some form of metric, add that quantitative analysis to our flexibility position. And this kind of brings me on to the last point, and that is to test its application. Now, when I say application, I mean this in the sense that when we're training flexibility, we're usually training it for some reason. We're trying to improve a position of some kind. And this might be as simple as we want to be more flexible, in which case we've kind of got the big 5 positions in which we might be trying to improve. That would be bridge, pike, front split, side split, and pancake. We can use these positions as our measures of assessment. So as I said to begin with, we might have a position that we come back to every 3 weeks, every 4 weeks. That position, for example, might be the pike. And that's the position that we're going to take photos of and we're going to make sure we're doing that warm up for, and then we do the tight position. That's our position, that's our reference point that we come back to see if the other work that we've been doing has helped. Another example might be if we're training flexibility to improve our squat or our deadlift position. Actually filming our squat on a deadlift and looking at how that movement is improving and how our position is can tell us in a much more practical way, actually, is that flexibility training that we're doing having an impact on our sport? Have a reference point to come back to. Because sometimes the practice and the application doesn't always correlate and maybe you're missing a piece, and this is another good way to assess if you're properly covering your base or not. But that's basically it. That's kind of a long-winded explanation of getting a little bit more analytical with your flexibility training. It's not just about how it feels definitely is important, but there's definitely other metrics that we can use to make sure we're still making progress or assess if we're making progress. And then if we're not, we can make tweaks, and if we are, we're just going to keep doing it. Now, I understand that this is only my opinion and probably limited, so if you have any suggestions, maybe things that I've missed or maybe things that you use that you want to recommend, then leave a comment in the comment section down below. I'd appreciate your input to join the conversation. If you just enjoyed this video and you found it helpful, make sure you hit that thumbs up button and support the channel. Right next to it is that subscribe button if you want to join the Bodyweight Warrior tribe and don't miss out any more future videos. But that's basically been it for this week, guys. I'll catch you in the next episode. Have a strong week and peace.